Hello, and thanks for joining today's webinar from Real Story Group. Pleased to have you here. This is Scott Dill from the business development team here with RSG, and we have our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, on the line with us as well. We're going to tackle a very exciting topic that's near and dear to our hearts about selecting the right CDP technology. Always an interesting marketplace to take a look at, and Tony's going to take you through the majority of today's presentation as he walks you through making sure you're picking the right platform for your particular needs. That's so critical for our subscribers that work with us on helping them select the right CDP technology. As we get started, though, I did want to mention a couple of quick things. We will have time for questions at the end. So if you have questions, you can enter those into the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll also get these slides out to everyone who's registered for today's presentation. And then for our subscribers in the line, this will be added to your subscriber library within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for that and the rest of our recorded content that's available to you. To get things started, for our new attendees here that haven't joined us in the past, welcome. Great to have you here, and give you a little bit back about Real Story Group. We've been at this now for 24 years, and the approach that we've always taken to the analysis that we provide on the vendors we cover in our research is that it's very hard-hitting, it's unbiased, and it's never influenced by the vendors in any way. We exist to sit on your side of the table to help you select the solutions that are the right fit for what it is you're trying to do. So we never speak at vendor conferences or get influenced by them in any way. Rather, we just want to make sure that you're making smart choices as you're making these important decisions for your enterprise. Tony's going to take you through the rest of the presentation, and I'll be back at the end for questions and next steps. So Tony, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. As many of you know, Real Story Group, we cover technologies across the MarTech stack. So there's different ways of visualizing the MarTech stack. For the last close to 20 years now, we've been using this subway map or tube map to show the different vendors and what lines they're on, which is roughly refers to what marketplaces do they have offerings for. And so today, of course, we're focused on the customer data platform marketplace. It's adjacent, of course, to a number of other marketplaces. And like other marketplaces, you have this city center with some of the big players like Oracle, Adobe, Microsoft, and others. And then you have a very active set of independent vendors out in the periphery. And so to that extent, it resembles a lot of other MarTech environments. You can imagine that most of the interesting innovation, of course, is happening at the periphery. So this is one way of just kind of visualizing the world of MarTech. We're going to focus on the orange line here, but one of the things we're going to be talking about, though, is how does this orange line intersect with all of these other lines as well. So just a quick preview of the agenda for the next half hour. It's going to be pretty fast paced. First, we'll talk about CDPs and what we describe as the new stack, the new MarTech stack for the second half of this decade. It's going to look very different than what many of us have been working on in the first half of this decade. And we'll get into some current CDP trends. This is really important because these trends are dramatically shaping the marketplace. We'll talk about that marketplace and then spend some time on what's the right way to select a CDP, whether you already have one and need a new one, which we're seeing more often, or you don't have a CDP and you're looking at maybe selecting one. And then, of course, we always wrap up with some key takeaways and next steps. So with that, let's get into it. So this is our kind of reference model for the MarTech stack of the 2020s. This is the B2C version. Structurally, the B2B version isn't much different. You've got engagement channels at the top. Of course, they're expanding all the time, different interaction delivery environments. Then you have these engagement services. That's the first kind of colored row in the middle here: customer care, loyalty, web content management, outbound marketing, so on and so forth. Many of us have been investing a lot in those services, in that service layer for really the past 2 decades, beefing up the platforms. The problem is that that's left a lot of our engagement kind of siloed and not very scalable, because each one of those colored boxes had their own data, their own decisioning, their own content, and that's not really working. So we think one of the real differentiators going forward for the MarTech stack is this notion of enterprise marketing foundation services, which are divided roughly into kind of 3 different categories. You've got content and information, data that we're fixed on today, and then decisioning, which ideally are all kind of independent platforms in your stack or independent capabilities in your stack that can serve all of your different channels. And of course, AI just brings a whole nother level to that. AI, we also believe, is ideally implemented as a layer in your stack rather than a feature showing up in all these different sorts of platforms. So one of the themes here is to have very loosely coupled, or in fact decoupled, capabilities from your engagement services that are increasingly strongly backed. So we're seeing more complexity, more people, more budget going to these enterprise foundation services, of which the middle row is obviously critical. And the rise of CDPs, in fact, was really one of the first bellwether signals that this transformational change in our stacks was happening, is that people wanted an independent platform that could then engage with all of their different engagement platforms and environments. And so what this has a lot of implications, and certainly this has evolved over time. Certainly how CDPs have fit into all of this has evolved. I think if we look at those 3 categories under the data part here, customer data activation, customer data management, enterprise data intelligence, initially CDPs were thought to maybe do all 3 of those. And I think we've learned over time, certainly the market has learned, certainly the vendors have learned, the analysts haven't always caught up, but the vendors have learned that these are 3 very different capabilities, and you don't necessarily want your CDP to be doing all 3 of those, especially I would say the bottom one around enterprise data intelligence. So what's happened over time is that the notion of what a CDP is has also evolved. So here's a new definition that at Real Story Group we're rolling out today, which is a CDP provides an independent hub for marketers to orchestrate and activate unified customer data across diverse engagement environments. Let's talk about that. Provides an independent hub. So the idea here is that it's not unduly bound to a particular vendor's operations or a particular application. So there are a lot, for example, of ESP or outbound campaign management platforms that also have their own data store, which they call a CDP, but really it's bound to their email marketing platform. So, it's not an independent hub. Now for marketers, this is the key thing. You could say business people if you wanted more than marketers, but the key thing is that this is not a data ops platform, and it's not an IT platform. It's for marketers to self-service. And what they want to self-service is to orchestrate and activate this data. In other words, to do stuff with it, not to manage it per se, but to do interesting things with it that will drive more customer value. They want to activate unified customer data. So in the vast majority of cases, that data is already going to be unified before it hits the CDP. And we'll talk about that. It's a key architectural consideration. Then again, across diverse engagement environments. So it should be decoupled from any vendor, should be decoupled from any delivery environment. It should be decoupled from paid media, inbound, outbound, so on, social, all of that. It should serve as kind of a neutral Switzerland. So this definition is really how kind of CDPs have ended up too. So this isn't just aspirational, this is really descriptive. But you see a lot of vendors kind of playing the edges with this. So that'll become a little bit more apparent if we talk about some current trends. So it's really interesting because there's a lot of trends going on right now in this market. We're identified 6 of them. We could probably come up with 6 more, but these are the 6 that are probably the most critical. One is this whole talk about composable CDPs. So what we're going to argue is that almost all CDPs are composable now. You have some from the big players that aren't. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what that means is that they're all in the process of leveraging your underlying customer data hubs. In other words, the raw customer data that you are assembling in lake houses, or in some cases just a single lake house. So they can leverage customer data from elsewhere. They're not necessarily unifying it themselves. The other thing, though, that's important to understand about composability is that every CDP does need to copy that data for if they want to support things like real-time events, inbound APIs, and decisioning. So at the end of the day, even the so-called composable CDPs are almost always copying your data as well for certain capabilities. A related point here is we're seeing kind of a reverse ETL backlash. So reverse ETL, capabilities have a definite place in the enterprise, but they don't really substitute for CDP. We find marketers don't want to use them generally for activating data. They end up being tools to support data ops, which is fine. But if you really want marketing self-service, then reverse ETL platforms really don't work very well. And there's also some critical functional gaps. Some CDPs are going backwards, so this is interesting. Basically what this is some CDPs are getting acquired by engagement vendors and used as kind of a captive data store. At that point, they lose their independence, and I would argue they're no longer CDPs. Some CDPs are adding multi-channel outbound campaign services and vice versa. What this means, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but what it tells you is that that CDP is targeting more the mid-market. The idea of this so-called customer engagement platform that has multi-channel marketing as well as a customer data store. Again, that's not going to be an independent CDP. It's going to be bound particularly to an outbound marketing platform. Here's the fifth one that might be controversial, which is AI is not really a differentiator in the CDP space. Because when you think about what you need for AI, you really need a superset of the data that's in more of an underlying lake house, as opposed to a CDP, which in the modern incarnation of it usually just has a subset of attributes. And so it's not going to work quite as effectively. Now, that doesn't mean that CDP vendors aren't going to be showing you all this AI this and AI that. All their investors are making them do that. And of course, they feel like they have to do that. But the reality is, for most CDPs, the AI is just demo candy. Most of the AI you're going to be doing is going to be by your underlying data ops team in an underlying raw customer data store. The good news is that the CDP market remains highly fragmented. Fragmented is kind of analyst speak for there are a hell of a lot of CDP vendors today, and there's going to be in the future. So what composability really means here is that you have this blue box on the left, which is customer data operations, where you ingest, process, and unify raw customer data and convert it into usable attributes. That's typically where you're going to do your most effective decisioning AI. And there's two customers of that downstream. One is data intelligence that needs their own data stores for analytics, modeling, reporting, and of course, insights AI. And then there's customer data activation. So this is essentially the data leverage and orchestration hub that we've been talking about that is really facing more the engagement services. This is what composability really means. And in this context, vendors which are the vast majority of CDP vendors that just focus on the orange box, are fundamentally composable platforms. Now, I've been making this distinction between a customer data hub and a customer data orchestration hub. So we have data management on the left, which is providing unified records for all your departments. This is really a data ops function. They're taking in first party, zero party, second party, third party data. And in this blue box over here, they're doing a lot of complicated data management: ingest, transform, clean, process, unify, enrich, comply, graph, apply rules. And then they're pushing those unified records out, a subset of them, as attributes, usually not as raw data, out to marketing, finance, customer service, compliance, sales, anybody who needs that. So the customer data hub handles heavy duty data management and identity resolution for all departments. It's a data ops function. Customer data leverage happens in the data orchestration hub, and this is what marketers use. Customer data orchestration hub is where marketing ops specialists activate data and orchestrate data for omni-channel journeys. So you have to have a customer API for inbound access. You're doing some segmentation, you're doing event handling, activation, maybe some light calculation, some personalization, some orchestration. There's a lot of real time happening here for your owned and operated channels, as well as targeted advertising. That is a marketing ops function. Now, what's confuses this a little bit is there's still some CDPs, including from some big vendors, that do both, and they may have a legitimate reason. Most CDPs are just focused on the right-hand side. I would argue that almost all your AI wants to happen back here in the customer data hub. And that's why if your CDP is more of an orchestration hub, it doesn't really need, nor would you want it to necessarily do a lot of AI services. What it's going to do is cache the values from the AI that's generated out of your customer data hub. In other words, your AI and ML tools will parse over all that raw data and come up with things like propensity models, propensity scores, next best action, and then push those into the CDP for the CDP to leverage. But the CDP itself doesn't necessarily do all of those calculations. Okay, so those are some trends. Those trends are really playing out in how the market landscape is evolving. And I just want to remind you, we're going through this pretty quickly. If you have any questions, comments, things you agree with, things you disagree with, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can start entering them now. For sure, we will get to them. All right, let's talk about the market. We've recently updated this chart. It was so fascinating when we started doing this 8 years ago. We had 2 boxes. Now we've got 7. So it's a really interesting market. We kind of turned it into a bit of a matrix here where you have independent vendors on the top row and then suite vendors on the bottom. We tend to be dismissive of the suite vendors. They certainly get a lot of noise and a lot of attention in the marketplace. They're mostly trying to market to your boss's boss's boss, which is already a bad sign because that means that they're not actually trying to prove themselves out. But in any case, you've got a lot of independents. All the suite vendors are here, the MarTech suite vendors. And then we make a distinction between vendors that are more focused on data ops and processing and those that are focused on leverage and orchestration. So if you remember that bifurcation I made in the previous slide, that's kind of played out here. So then within the leverage side, you've got activation oriented, decisioning oriented, you have warehouse only. So these are primarily the reverse ETL vendors I was talking about. And then you have some classic B2B data vendors that have kind of added on a CDP because they've kind of felt like they had to. All 4 of them are exceptionally weak. There's definitely kind of a hole in the B2B market. We can talk about that later if you want some more details. So this is the marketplace as a whole. Again, I wanted to sort of warn you away from 2 biggies in particular, Salesforce and Adobe. This is a story that they're trying to tell to your executives that if you just go with us, we're going to solve all of your integration problems. Those of you who have worked with these tools know that that's complete bullshit. But it is a very powerful story, and you really need to push back. There's several issues here. 1, their offerings are quite immature. 2, despite whatever they say, they're very much bound to their own engagement platform. So this is a way of kind of, both vendors have very aging engagement platforms, and this is a way of trying to keep you locked into them far beyond what you might otherwise do. So the way to get around this is to have a more test-based selection process instead of defaulting to one of these 2 vendors. And that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute. But the other thing that I talked about too was some CDP vendors almost kind of exiting this market, usually because they got acquired by an engagement vendor. And so now they're not an independent CDP, they're essentially what we would call a captive data store. So we've graded 4 of them, 5 of them out here, where you want to be really careful with these vendors. If you're already licensing them, you're probably okay, at least for a little while. You may not want to select them afresh because they're tied into somebody else's agenda, and they're likely to become a captive data store as opposed to a CDP is the way that we defined it. Having said that, you still see a lot of colored logos here, a lot of choices. Some are a little bit more vertically focused. Some are more mid-market focused. Some have some geographic focus. Certainly a lot of different sizes here. So you have a variety of choices. These are all firms that have been around for a while. Some are a little bit more consulting heavy, and others are a little bit more pure software. So, there's a whole wide set of spectrums here that you can dig deeply. And of course, that's what we do as part of our research. But this is a pretty good summary of where the market is here in the mid 2020s. So you have a lot of choices. I think that was really the key takeaway. So I see a question from Sarah. Will this deck be shared with the group? And yes, Sarah, the deck will be shared with the group. If you're a Real Story Group subscriber, you will also have access to the full recording of this webinar. Okay, let's talk about selecting CDPs. So the first thing is, whenever a Real Story Group evaluates any MarTech vendors, any marketplace, we use what we call kind of canonical kind of meta use cases, right? So these are business use case categories. For CDPs, it's interesting because it's a very broad set of categories. We've identified at least 10 potential CDP business use case categories, from, again, advanced customer data management. You don't see as much. Predictive analytics, again, probably don't want that if the CDP isn't the superset of all of your customer data, which it probably isn't. The 6 you see on the far right are the ones that are most common. Different vendors focus on them in different ways. Not all CDP vendors support all these use cases. In fact, we find the typical CDP vendor really emphasizes more like 2 or 3 or 4 of these at best, and can kind of sort of talk to some of the others. So the real question is, what's more important to you? We use these 10 use case categories when we evaluate CDP. So if you get access to our research and you want to say household and channel support is really important to me, or personalization, inbound personalization, we're really looking for that out of the CDP layer as opposed to some other layer, then you can filter through our evaluations of vendors, of which vendors are really strong or weak in those areas. But certainly this should give you some grist for thinking about your own use cases. And that's really important, because we're going to argue here in a second that these kind of practical use case scenarios, business use case scenarios, should form the core of your tender or solicitation or RFP. And the reason for that is that's really a key part of design thinking. And at Real Story Group for the last 2 decades, we've been working really hard to apply the principles of design thinking to the process of technology selection. So that means you need to be business focused. Still means you need IT and the data ops team involved, but you have to be focused on business outcomes. It's team-based, empirical, which means you actually test the solutions. It's iterative, which means you go through a filtration process where you increasingly get smarter about what the vendors do and what you really need. And it's adaptive, so that you don't have to get your requirements perfect right up front, which is really important, particularly if this is the first time you're ever using or purchasing a CDP. I can guarantee you your out-of-the-gate requirements are not going to be 100% accurate until you actually test them against the market, and then you're going to want to adapt your requirements before you make final decisions. We put all of that in a book called The Right Way to Select Technology that you can find at Amazon or from Rosenfeld Media. It's basically a cookbook for how to do this. So if I was going to put the cookbook on one slide, it would be this, which is you might have 30 plus CDP vendors out there. You create some diverse use case stories, which you can then map against vendor strengths and weaknesses to filter down from 30 to say 6 to 8 vendors, where you then create an RFP. The heart and soul of your RFP should be these specific use cases. Now, you're going to have various personas in these use cases, including marketing ops, maybe channel marketers, certainly data ops, certainly customers and prospects will be key personas. So these are test cases for actually testing out a CDP. And so you get vendors, maybe at that point, you're filtering down to 4 vendors after RFPs that you want to bring in for demos. Again, during this round, you're demoing your user stories, not their user stories, but your user stories. Sometimes you can combine, in fact, quite often when we're advising a large firm, we'll combine the green and the orange layer there and do that together. Saves you a lot of time and hassle. Can't always do that, but usually you can. Now, the key thing is the darker orange box, second from the bottom, and that is the prototyping phase. And so that's when you want to do a hands-on bake-off. Now, a lot of people think, whoa, CDP, try before you buy, that's impossible. Well, I am here to tell you that we have done this more than 24 times, and it is totally possible to do a hands-on week-long sprint with a CDP platform before you license it. You absolutely, absolutely want to do that. We could definitely, if you reach out to us, we can give you more details about just how you do that. There are a lot of templates for how to do that. But it's amazing what you learn, not just about yourself, but about the vendor. So you go to the vendor and you want to sign a contract. Because it has to do with customer data, I can guarantee you those contract negotiations are not going to be short. I think the fastest we ever saw was 6 weeks, and that customer was not particularly aggressive. If you're a large enterprise, you're probably looking at 3 to 9 months to negotiate a contract on a CDP. I wish it was shorter, but it usually isn't. So what do you do with that time? You don't sit there sitting on your thumbs. What you want to do is do some testing, do a proof of concept with the finalist vendor. So again, you're testing some more against some specific use cases. You may learn some things that may tell you how you want to modify the actual contract, but among other things, you're going to prep yourself for a much faster implementation, much faster rollout once you actually do sign that contract. So this is the design thinking approach, getting from 30 vendors down to a single finalist where you really know what you're going to license. And we know for a fact that in many, many cases, organizations that bought CDPs, that licensed CDPs at the end of the last decade or the beginning of this one, sometimes kind of bought spur of the moment and made some bad choices, and now they're looking at version 2. So it is possible to make poor choices here, but not if you take the methodical approach to this. All right, let's wrap up with some takeaways. We've already seen one. I see some other questions appearing. You're welcome to add more questions. CDPs are continuing to evolve. Architectural fit is really paramount in this. In other words, are you looking for it to be more of a customer data processing hub or more of a customer data activation hubs? More and more we see enterprises really wanting to use it as an activation hub. You want to beware the major suite vendors and CDPs that have kind of digressed into captive data stores that are no longer independent. The canonical business scenarios for CDPs are unlikely to change much. So that's actually good. Those top 10 are still there. And so you want to get clear about what's important for your enterprise. The vendors are definitely sorting out into different categories, which we mentioned. We've got 7 different categories. You've got data hubs versus orchestration hubs, independents versus the suite vendors, so on and so forth. The way to really conclude what's the right fit for you is to employ an agile-oriented selection process featuring adaptive testing. So definitely use architecture as a filter, but then prioritize your business scenarios. You're still going to need developers and data analysts as part of this picture, but you're really looking for a more marketing-oriented solution. Certainly, we have a lot of research and advisory that can help you make the right decision and get to value faster. I think that's one of the other benefits of this agile process is that you get to value faster. A lot of times, we see organizations license a CDP and they really don't begin to even hardly use it for the first 12 to 18 months. You want to come right out of the gate and get value out of this. So there's 3 ways that Real Story Group can help you do that. One is to help you find the best fit vendor through our research and advisory. Second is to help you optimize your entire stack with a full stack license to all of our research, and then we help you sort of tune what's the best stack for yourself. And then we have a council which is exclusively enterprise MarTech leaders. We call it the MarTech Leadership Council. It's a peer group, meets every couple months virtually and twice a year in person. Feel free to ping us if your firm is interested in joining. Again, no vendors, no consultants, just end users. So Scott, there's some questions rolling in. I'm going to take a quick look at that, and then we can get to some of the questions here.
Yeah, great, Tony. In fact, one of the topics that the council recently covered was taking your CDP to the next level. So hearing some case studies from council members on how their selections went, how their rollouts have gone, and if they're maybe looking at the next evolution for them and CDP. So certainly a hot topic amongst that group. And if you'd like to learn more about that or how you can get direct access to Tony and the rest of our analyst team as part of your CDP journey, please don't hesitate to reach out. I do see some questions that have come in. So Tony, you want to take a crack at those?
Yeah, so the first question is from Stein, and he's asking, any reason Sitecore CDP plus personalized, formerly BoxEver, is not part of the CDP marketplace matrix? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, nominally, I guess we could slip it in there. We don't get a lot of inquiries about it. When Sitecore acquired it, they seemed to be really focused on aligning it with their existing suite of tools. And so we tend not to see new customers license it unless they're really kind of going all in with Sitecore. It was also more of a mid-market sort of solution, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but for our customer base, we didn't get a lot of inquiries. You know, we could probably go 50-50 on that. I think, you know, we could think about adding it if we did get some inquiries. So it's a good call out to say that it's missing, but our sense is not necessarily a strong player in the market. Sven is asking, are there any open source CDPs out there? Are they competitive from your point of view, taking all 10 use cases in? It's a really interesting question, Sven. I think there has not been, there was sort of one attempt from a French firm whose name escapes me right now that does have an open source CDP. You can probably look it up. It was just really a very simple sort of data store with an API on top of it and not much else. And it turns out that this is actually pretty heavyweight, high compute, which is expensive sort of capabilities, and I think the market has really wanted to go more for SaaS-based solution as opposed to kind of single tenant on-prem or self-hosted solutions. There's still a few of those out there. And because of the integration, I mean, a CDP is really an integration hub at the end of the day. That also proved a little bit tricky because of the investment you need to make in connections and connector frameworks. So unlike some other markets like digital asset management, web content management, we haven't seen a lot and a lot of open source. Even Acquia, which is the power behind Drupal, the big open source CMS, I mean, when they acquired a CDP, they acquired a commercial one, and it's still commercial. Sarah's asking a really good question. What's the distinction between activation and decisioning oriented CDP categories? So that's a good question. In reality, that line, Sarah, is a little bit fungible. The activation-oriented CDPs tend to not be as much focused on sort of real-time events and more in terms of just sort of pushing data out to other platforms. They're the ones that are most likely to bundle an ESP or outbound marketing. They very often don't have journey orchestration. As a consequence, they often are simpler, and in many cases, simpler is better. Sven is asking, in which situation should I prefer a data hub as opposed to an orchestration hub? So, you know, what you have, Sven, is a set of the market that offers you both. And so for example, the SAP CDP, which we don't recommend, but Treasure Data and Amperity do this today, where they are both, they combine, and so does Redpoint Global, by the way. I'd say those four are probably the biggest, where they combine both the data processing and the data activation, often with different modules, by the way. So one is run by the data ops team and the other. So they're basically bundling those two. And sometimes there's a reason why the enterprise wants that. Usually it's because I don't already have an enterprise data team that's going to give me access to a customer data store that's built in a data lakehouse. So the marketing team needs to kind of go out and just acquire this, maybe along with the data team, and essentially have a totally separate customer data ops framework. And that feels architecturally messy, but it's interesting. Some of our larger clients have actually gone that way and have been happy doing that. The trend, however, is in the opposite direction, where you're kind of home building your own customer data management and processing hub, and then using a CDP on top of that as your leverage and orchestration hub. So again, a CDP can combine both, but that's not so much the trend. Zane is asking, what do you think of CDPs being used on private cloud? Well, some you can do that with. There's some single tenant CDPs that they will let you do it, and you might have some reasons for cost or otherwise. There's no reason not to explore it. It's definitely going to reduce the options, though, Zane, in front of you. Sven is asking, as a European, I always struggle with SaaS, especially from the US regarding GDPR these days. Yeah, and a lot more than GDPR. I mean, I think there's data residency and all kinds of other issues coming up, particularly with the current administration on this side of the Atlantic. And so you want to be careful, particularly with some of the larger American CDP vendors that cannot host you in like a European instance of one of the hyperscalers like Amazon or Google or Microsoft. And so that can also limit your choices. Having said that, there's a number of European players. Unfortunately, many, not all of them, but many are a little bit immature and a little bit more consulting-ware oriented. So, you know, we can talk in more detail about that. You do have some choices, but you also face some trade-offs. Okay, with that, we have run a little bit late. Thanks for sticking around. Feel free to contact us at any of these coordinates here. Always a pleasure spending time with you. Scott, remind us again, what's the next webinar that's coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. It's on July 16th. It's on how to get to Web CMS 4.0.
Oh yeah, WCM 4.0, really super exciting topic. It relates a little bit to CDP in some ways that we'll describe. Feel free to sign up for that. You can find it on our website. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne. So long until next time.